Just to start and say thank you for joining us at the Shared Futures Conference, the start of. And I'm Marley Mckenzie, and I am the creative founder and director of Moville Theatre CIC. And hi. And yeah, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself and my journey, and then I would do a short performance for you as well, so you can kind of see what type of work I do. And also the piece itself is going to, you know, set up for the conference as well. So as I said before, if you're joining us now, my name's Marley Mckenzie, and I'm the creative director of Moville Theatre CIC, and also Marley Mckenzie Theatre. And I've been a creative performer for over 15 years now, which is shocking when someone said, how long have you been doing this for? And I was like, 15 years. Feels like yesterday when I graduated. I graduated in 2004 at Begum Theatre School and trained as a theatre actor. I then came out of theatre school and got into doing workshops. And from that, I think that's where I started to see my career change. Rather than thinking that I was going to be on EastEnders or other television and TV programs, I started to think about my work and what my work could do for people. So at that time, I was doing a lot of workshops, working with young girls and boys, looking at body image and identity and self-esteem. And then that's when I started to look at myself as a performer, and certain jobs that would come up, I would go for it, but I wouldn't get it. And also some of the types of roles that were there, I wasn't really feeling those roles. And so I had an opportunity in 2011 to do a one-woman show. And this one-woman show stemmed from all the workshops that I was doing, but also how I felt as a young Black woman in the industry. And it was about skin bleaching and identity. And so from there, I created this show. Never directed, never written work, did lots of devising, but never wrote any work. And then I created Light, which was the one-woman show. And the response from that was like, we've got something. So from that, I wanted to do more work in terms of that and my voice being heard. During that time, I found out that I was dyslexic, and I just dismissed it because I was just like, I've coped for this long, I continue coping. But then when I had to fill out applications, yeah, that's when the struggle started, where I was battling with how to, write the sentences, the language, how you put down certain stuff to the funders to kind of convey what your project's about. And I did well, but I always had to get my sister to look at it, and she'd be like, oh, you've got to put this here, you've got to put that there. And it was a battle for me. But then even though that was a struggle, I also had my own struggles as just trying to be a creative person, trying to create work that makes a difference, and wanting to be a better creative individual. And this is where Moville was born. Again, I've not had any experience setting up a theatre company, but I did. And I think what I learned on this journey so far is courage, and also having thick skin, because there were so many no's, but I don't call them no's because they were yeses, because the position that I'm in now is very different. And if I had stopped, just when I wrote out my timeline, I should have stopped in 2007 because of all the knockbacks that I had. But there was something in me that continued, and I started to learn and started to grow as a person, as an individual, and also started to understand that things weren't fair, and my work was starting to reflect what was actually going on. And I knew I was an actor, a Black actress, but the industry and even the kind of barriers made me know that I was a Black female actor, stroke creative performer, stroke going into a creative director and owning a theatre company. So at this time now, as I stand before you, or sit before you now, I am sitting in my uncomfortableness, because the project that I'm doing now, which ties in with this, is a project called If Your Face Fits. And as I was talking about this, I started to challenge funders. Why is it that sometimes I'm not getting funding opportunities and whatnot? But anyway, from doing that, this is where I'm at, and this is where I want to do, is speak about the challenges that we're doing. So I'm not going to speak to, I'm going to stop there, actually. I'm going to stop there because the performance will speak for itself, okay? So the piece is called You Don't Speak for Me. You don't speak for me when you look nothing like me. You don't know the struggle, the fight, the pain I have lived. Physically put on my size 8 shoes and go forth. I can't put on your size 4 shoes and walk your walk. What makes people think that we're the same? Just because we fall under the BAME. It's lazy, that acronym, BAME, Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic. That's it, lump us all together in a brown box. Clearly, in terms of culture, history, religion, we're separated anyway. Okay, labels. Doctor, solicitor, dentist, excelling in this game compared to being aggressive, ghetto, angry, ratchet. It's just shame. I dare not show passion. I'm afraid to upset Claire. I think you'd prefer a refined, more tasteful version of oneself to speak on my behalf, to make yourself feel that you've done your job. And there's butterflies and roses and we live in perfect harmony, so that at the end of the year, you can tick all your boxes. Tick the box, we have listened. Tick the box, we have engaged and made contact with a BAME. After all, they're all the same. No. No. Systematic funders. I mean, sympathetic funders. Dyslexic starts to play its game. Or was it a Freudian slip? Anyway, as I sit in my size 8 shoes, waiting and anticipating on decisions based as to whether I get the spot for the BAME, all my insecurities, past barriers, and the imposter within stares me dead in the face. Stupid. Can I do this? Am I worthy? Am I even talented? Where do I get funding for my work as an individual person? I can't even write an application. I'm dyslexic. I failed my English lit because my teacher didn't see that I was dyslexic. Yep, you've guessed right. She thought I wasn't that bright. Will they like my project? Will they like my work? Does it sound too Black? Will it be better than the other BAME company? Am I the only one from the West Midlands? After Black Lives Matters, now, am I getting funding because they can see my passion and the value that the work gives to others? Or is it because I'm on trend? When I'm no longer fashionable, will I revert back to the heartache and questions that labelled me mundane? I hope that it's not a phase. I hope you see me as not the stereotype version of me. I hope to get rid of the crab in the barrel mentality. I hope that we are seen for our talent, our intelligence, and our love for what we do. I hope that today we listen, really listen, to take the time to re-educate ourselves and sit in our uncomfortableness. From this, we learn to accept, to grow, so that we become better versions of ourselves. That leads to the last point. I know that we all have a story to tell, and how we choose to tell that story, or how you choose to tell that story, is up to you. I don't speak for you, but you can and will speak for yourself. And that's my truth.
Thank you so much, Marlene, for that powerful piece. The piece indeed spoke for itself, and it set the perfect tone for our time together. Good morning,
Thank you.
everybody. My name is Carol Akiwumi, and I'm the CEO and the founder of Money for You. I'll be telling you a little bit more about my organization later in the afternoon during my session, but right now, I just wanted to welcome you to this 2-day online conference. Before I do that, I really want to thank Marlene for giving us a glimpse of her courage and thick skin, one that reflects the lived experience of so many people from diverse ethnic communities. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this 2-day conference organized by the Runnymede Trust and the National Lottery Community Fund, as well as the CREM project. It's called Shared Futures, Funders, Funding, and the BME Third Sector. I wonder if Marlene takes issue with that. In any case, we hope that you agree that it's going to be an engaging and stimulating program. It's actually very timely. We've programmed a number of different kinds of contributions, and you're all welcome to move around the conference as you see fit, attending all and any of the sessions that interest you. The program is very flexible. It'll allow you to watch and participate in the live stream over the next 2 days, or to access all of the recordings and program content in your own time up until 31st of May. Now, to give you a bit of a guide, we have the opening and closing panel discussions, which are a chance for you to air the big themes, the big debate, and the big conversations taking place about sustainable funding and investment for the BME third sector. Funders in particular are encouraged to attend the Visioning Seminar tomorrow, where the Ubele Initiative and Charity So White will be dreaming about what a more effective and responsive funding infrastructure for the BME-led third sector could look like here in the UK. Funders would also like to encourage you to follow the seminar strand entitled New Models, New Methods, New Approaches. In these sessions, we want to challenge all of our, friends and funders to reflect on their own processes and practices, and to try out in their own minds the fresh ideas, the new models, the new data, and the new research being presented to them. The overwhelming majority of attendees at this conference are leaders and founders and project managers. And so I want to draw your attention to the seminar sessions that are labeled Insights, Tips, and Time Savers. They're a chance for you to try out, again, in your own minds, the different development models each seminar leader presents to you. As you all know, deciding on your business model is such a fundamental decision and will have implications for where your funding will come from and how you will work to establish your projects and organizations. The organizers of this event, the Runnymede Trust, also want to encourage you particularly to connect with each other. We all know that leaders and founders like myself are often working in under-resourced isolation. This is especially true of leaders from diverse ethnic communities where the struggle to realize the fruits of their work can seem like a long, long road. So take advantage of the gift of this conference, what it gives you, and reach out and connect with your peers. Feel free to drop, your LinkedIn profiles in the chat and connect with each other. But beyond that, on both days at 1 p.m., we have scheduled a fun speed networking session where three of you will be put together randomly into a breakout room, and you'll have 3 minutes to get to know each other before you're randomly assigned to another room for another 3 minutes. Think about it like speed dating, but for, this particular conference. All the conference attendees are encouraged to participate so that we can all work collectively to break down this isolation. If you're a funder, a seminar leader, a panelist, a stakeholder, or an ally, you're also encouraged to participate. This is a chance to get to know the faces and personalities of the characters of the many, many ethnic, diverse, community-led projects and organizations. To attendees, feel free to use the community feature on Woover and send direct emails to each other or to start chat subjects. Some of you have already, and that's been really exciting to see and to follow over the last couple of days. So we encourage you to both send messages to the people who interest you and to be open and responsive if somebody sends you a message. Now, before I move the whole conference on to listen to David Bryan's keynote speech, I also wanted to be clear that this conference, although it's led by people from ethnic diverse communities, it is also a shared space. We've intentionally conveyed as many perspectives on the subject as were available to us. Attendees to this conference also include stakeholders and their staff who've been working on supporting this third sector, this BME or diverse community third sector, often for decades. It also includes allies, it includes supporters who are interested in the perspectives that we hold. As it's a shared space, different contributors and attendees are also bringing their own preferred terminology. The Runnymede Trust use BME, others use BAME. My organization uses BAMA or people of color. Some people use BIPOC or racialized minority. Very often you'll hear me say ethnic, diverse communities, because I really like that. It reflects who we are. As well as all that, we've used BME third sector, but you will hear BME civil society. Others use VCS, which stands for voluntary and community services. Organizations such as Rota and BTEC and Voice for Change England have been supporting the BME third sector for decades, and they have their own experiences with funders and funding. So the program that we've got for you deliberately centers on those experiences. So look out for short Q&As with Maurice McLeod, Sebasum Rashid, and Kunle Olulode, the respective chief executives of those organizations. I'll be your MC. It gives me great pleasure, to curate, to help with curating this. And you'll see me again for most of tomorrow. But in the afternoon, I have a session and Marlene will take over. On that note, I'd love to welcome Dr. Halima Begum on behalf of Runnymede Trust, Rachel Stevens on behalf of Community Fund, and Lee Pinkerton on behalf of the CREM Project. Welcome, Halima.
Thank you so much. I was just waiting to see whether Lee and others were going to go before me. Thank you for the warm introduction. And I think I'm still with Marlene's spoken words, really, and still kind of thinking really, really reflectively about what you raised, Marlene, because there's officially raising the issues in the conference, and there's the poetic way that you raised it, which I think really, really kind of resonated with all of us, aren't we? So we're all thinking about those issues now in a much more emotive way, a much more passionate way, I hope. And I just wanted to say thank you for kind of opening the conference in that way, and thank you for hosting, as you have so eloquently done so, to open the issues in a more formal way. I'm Halima Begum. I lead the Runnymede Trust. We are in a convening role here today. So we're going to do a lot of listening. We're going to do a lot of convening. We're going to do a lot of work behind the scenes to hear your experiences and actually connect up your experiences to different funders, players, partners, so that this becomes the collective conversation and dialogue that it needs to be. So that's as much as I'm going to say now, because I would like to hear from everybody else. What a fantastic way to start the day. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to hand over to you again.
Thank you. So let's move on to one of the main events of this whole conference, our keynote speech from David Bryan. David will tell you more about himself as part of his speech, which we recorded last week. His speech will be immediately followed by a panel discussion chaired by Halima, who you just heard from. And I believe Lee will be running that video. Thank you, Lee.
My personal background, I have a background in the media. I used to work at The Voice newspaper many years ago when it was Britain's best black newspaper. I've only joined this sector in the last couple of years when I joined the CREM project. So explaining what that is, as you probably are all aware, every one of you would no doubt love to have a full-time comms officer working 5 days a week. Unfortunately, because of funding issues that will be discussed at length throughout these 2 days, very few organizations can afford to fund a comms officer full-time. So a couple of years ago, the Runnymede Trust, Black Training and Enterprise Group, and Race on the Agenda came together and made a joint bid for funding to have a comms officer that they could share. And so that became the CREM project, CREM standing for, an acronym standing for Communicating the Race Equality Message Effectively. So about a year and a half ago, I joined that. And so pre-COVID, when we used to work in offices, I used to spend 2 days a week at Rota's office, 1 day a week at Runnymede's office, and 1 day a week at BTEG's office. And then the other day of the week, I was meant to go out in the community and work with other small organizations. And that's how it worked for about 6 months until the lockdown came. So now, because I'm working from home, I'm available to everybody all the time. So I work for everybody 5 days a week, which would have been previously impossible. But now, thanks to Zoom, it is. So Carol asked me to get involved with this. Obviously, I know Carol through Runnymede. And because I work with Rota and BTEG, she asked me if I could get them involved as well. And then Carol also asked me to help with some of the publicity. And then Carol asked me to do something else and then something else. And I said, well, I might as well just sponsor this thing, because since the goals of this conference, which is to bring organizations within our sector together, are so similar to the goals of what I do, which is to promote the work of race equality organizations, there's such a great overlap that I might as well become a sponsor and get more heavily involved. So I've recorded videos with the leaders of Voice for Change England, BTEG and Rota, and then also the keynote speech from David that you're about to hear. So I believe I can share screen, so I'll do that now. And
before you do,
yeah,
just have a little introduction from Abdou Sidibe, who is standing in for Rachel Stevens.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so whilst you're cueing your video, thank you. Hi, Abdou, and welcome.
Morning. Yeah, I'm not Rachel, but I'll try and make as good of an impression as she would have done. But no, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here this morning, and what a great performance from Marlene. And I'm still reflecting on it, to be honest. And I think I went back sort of reflecting on my own experience, professional experience, but also personal experience. as a Black man, and sort of working in the charity sector initially for 15 years with underrepresented communities, marginalized communities, lots of different terminologies really around it. And I found myself now in the funding sector for the last 3 years. So I'm head of funding, mainly working in the Yorkshire and Humber region at the National Lottery Community Fund. And obviously, we are one of the largest funder in the UK. And I think your performance is really showing the need for us to actively listen, to embrace the challenge of today and listen to what it's like for groups, many groups and talented people who are trying to apply for funding, but don't always have a consistent experience or positive experience about it. So it's a real pleasure to be part of this event and being able to support it. But we have to thank the Run Limit Trust really for organizing the event and making it happen, because it wouldn't have happened without them really. And behind the scene, they've done so much to enable us to have the ability to see a couple of you as individuals, to look at your applications and ideas so we can discuss sort of our internal processes and be a bit more open and giving you the opportunity really to discuss those project ideas you've got when it's difficult to put it on paper, half of the time. And I think we'd really like to have the feedback as to how that works, because I see this as the start of a relationship. So it's not, I hope it's not going to be just a one-off event. It could be different, but I think we want to continue to engage and look at ways we can become a more inclusive funder. But it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'll try and attend as many sessions as I can today. And I hope people will get a lot out of the event as well. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And over to you, Lee.
Okay, I'll attempt now to share my screen and play this video from David.
And I'm here giving the keynote as one of the core team from the Common Cause Research project that initiated this day's activities. Currently, I chair 3 arts organisations: Brixton House, Battersea Arts Centre, and Voluntary Arts. For most of my working life, I've been self-employed. Over the years, I've worked for government departments, local authorities, the NHS, voluntary organisations, funders, and arts organisations. Quite a spectrum of organisations. I hope to draw on that experience and knowledge. I got involved in Common Cause Research because I was keen to find out how Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities could secure investment by collaborating with universities, rather than reliance on the limited pool of sympathetic funders that were known to support our organisations. I wanted our communities to know that there are other avenues for support, never easy, but out there, that could enable our organisation to fundraise and increase profile. So I want to talk about how our organisations are overlooked, undervalued, and the importance of us being explicit about our racism and discrimination within Britain. I know we know some of this, but I want us to remind ourselves that we are working in challenging environments in order that we can achieve considerable success and impact for society as a whole. I want to also affirm the importance of us talking in detail about our needs in a racist society. The recent sewage report, notwithstanding, I clearly want to use the word sewage there as opposed to sewer. It belongs in the sewage. It really is not worth our while dwelling too long on that particular report. It poses challenges, but we have to move forward as we always do in an endeavour to make our way forward in this society. I want to encourage us to explicitly locate our endeavours as constructive and essential contributors to civil society, because we are endeavouring to build the society we are in to be a better place, and that requires that we confront its shortcomings. Money always captures people's attention, so let me be clear. I'm not a funding directory or an oracle on fundraising who is going to rattle off the names of good funders, out the bad ones, or tell you where pots of gold are stashed. When I deliver fundraising courses, note past tense, I'd attempt to make it simple and ask, why do you need money? Can you make a convincing story and persuade everyone? How will you know the intervention will have impact other than through your sweat and devotion? I'm not an academic. I no longer run voluntary organisations, and I'm not a funder. That said, however, I have been, and at some point, all of the above for a variety of institutions, so I have some useful insights to offer. However, my involvement in community organizations began when I was at Tulsa School, a South London comprehensive in the late 1960s. We were, as was the world, greatly influenced by the civil rights movement and countries seeking independence. The Black students in the sixth form established a Black Studies program open to all. As a consequence of this, I began agitating for Black British history to be incorporated into the mainstream teaching of history in our schools. I survived Tulsa, an 1800 all-boys school just outside Brixton, where the Black student population felt like it was a majority. Even the students studying Latin were as militant as those in the on-site pupil refer units. Those were formative years where, in my view, many of us, myself included, progressed in spite of the school, not because of it. In those days, you could be suspended from school for having an afro or expressing empathy with the civil rights movement. And yes, I had a modest afro. I won't lay claims to anything major, but it was of a comparable standard in my view. Just to give you wider context, I was 12 in 1968. Racial politics and immigration in the UK then, as now, was volatile and hostile. The American Civil Rights Movement was in its full flight and Martin Luther King was assassinated. The women's movement was challenging and making its voice heard across all classes. Apartheid was still dominant in South Africa. There were demonstrations about anti-war and against Vietnam. Students were playing a leading role in the world, challenging oppressive democracies. The colour buy in Britain was widespread. And Enoch Powell made his River of Blood speech. That was 1968. That was a time in which I was engaged and beginning to understand the nature of our society and wanted to make an impact. I left school at the age of 16 with a preoccupation for societal change. Initially, I was focused on running a Black bookshop in Brixton, just 100 yards from where the previous Black-run bookshop had been burnt down. I turned my passion for reading about the Third World, as it was called then, into skills to run a values-based social enterprise. I joined several local groups trying to find a way to make a bigger impact. Some were about acquisition of knowledge, others were about making a local impact. The bookshop combined both and placed me in the company of some amazing people within the collective and the community. We felt we could make a radical difference. So we moved from the outskirts of Brixton, where we were located, to its center. We left our neighbors, the Black Panthers, the Race of Day Collective, and the Gay Helpline, and moved towards West Indian Parents Action Group and the Brixton Law Center. We organized the first Black book fair in the UK. We, in effect, were building an institution in order to do politics, with no long-term plan other than survival. There were hard times. The miners were on strike, and most people had to work a 3-day week if they had a job. After years of being a driver for change in Brixton, with voluntary organizations working with African, Caribbean, Asian-led organizations, and those working against injustice, I became self-employed. How insane can you be to be doing that at that time? But my plan was to see how powerful institutions made decisions in the real world and learn to lead. Towards the end of the 1970s, I went to the United States for a holiday. And at one point I found myself in a brunch organized by a Black counselor in Boston. It was an event he organized at the end of summer, and I was just fortunate to be there at the right time. It was an incredible event with Black students from Harvard. One of my main takeaways was a metaphor given by a Black professor of psychology. He said that each of us had a responsibility to see ourselves as having left our villages to find sustenance, but then to return to share that sustenance and knowledge. Those days seem very similar, not the same, to where we are now, to what is happening now. Then as now, there was a strong distrust of the police by working class communities up and down the country, including the women's movement, especially after their Reclaim the Night campaign in 1977. The actions taken by communities and our allies to press for societal change have made some advantage, but the subtle and not so subtle manifestations of racism persist, is entrenched, and stretch beyond institutional boundaries. Many organizations are created to advocate, educate, and influence policy, support the poor and marginalized, challenge the failings of powerful institutions, be that of the police, Grenville, Windrush, abuses in education, and much more. But a long list of Black people have died in police custody as well, year after year, and they are rarely acknowledged in the British press and media. It is not the brutality and the impervious nature of the police that is the only challenge we have. It is the orchestration of the hostile environment that draws institutions into a web of compliance with procedures and legal justifications, where employees, new and established, are now required to bring passports to prove their right of employment in their jobs that they've been doing for years and years. Little has changed over my 50 years of engagement in campaigns or working on governance issues. Some people might think this statement is unfair and unfounded. I will suggest that they are living in a bubble or an alternative reality, not far from what we now recently have encountered with the Sewell report. An alternative reality is what that reflects. They are clearly not aware of or kept track with the relentless reports across all aspects of British life that point to persistent inequalities and discrimination. Every department, every sector, that those reports are being churned out year after year as a tribute to our struggles and our discrimination. The resistance to talk about racism in Britain is phenomenal. And while it has improved according to the British Futures recent survey, it is still poor. Another low bar. British and Black and Asian lives have complex and varied intersections, as should be expected. Black Lives Matter has sparked not only a global movement, but it has challenged liberals and radicals alike to demonstrate that they will confront the structures and processes that maintain discrimination. Gary Young recently wrote in the Weekend Financial Times, and I quote, "Every now and then, much of Britain discovers racism in much the same way that teenagers discover sex. The general awareness that it is out there collides with the urgent desire to find out where," end of quote. It is vital that for the well-being of all in our society that this discovery is made, but not at the expense of the same excluded people. A number of organizations are now tentatively trying to have honest conversations about race. Some will honestly say that they are comfortable with gender and sexual orientation, but less so about class and not at all about race. A number of organizations are now tentatively trying to have honest conversations about race. Some will honestly say that they are comfortable with gender and sexual orientation, but less so about class and not at all about race. There will be those that want no discomfort as an attempt to fill knowledge voids, confront false assumptions that reinforce white privilege. Sadly, there will still be many that will restrict themselves to a tick box process in order to curtail the emotional discomfort and exposure and please their funders. Learning is difficult. As a nation, we have a learning opportunity. Some people want to characterize the challenge on colonial statues as a binary issue. Do they stay or do they go? But behind the statues are questions that challenge the historical myth dished out for hundreds of years that portrayed British colonialism as a benevolent endeavor, and that Britain became great from its brilliant business acumen. Nothing about the genocides and barbarism and vast wealth that was generated, that culminated ultimately in the devastation of colonial countries. If funders do not understand the context in which we operate, they will also consign the work of our organizations as marginal, culturally specific, or short-term problem that eventually the state will fix. Before I move on to talking about funders and their investments or lack of, I want to acknowledge the importance of our enablers, our conveners, catalysts, and trust builders. These people are vital to our formation of community organizations that underpin civic life. These are the people who experience or identify a problem or need and seek to address it. They plunge into a world armed with passion and a resolve to make a difference. We give our time because we care. We are passionate because we care. We are determined because it matters. All our successes build confidence, a real sense of community, and signal possibilities. My experience of funding covers the gambit of naive applicant to grant advisor and funder. I have had success and setbacks. On one occasion, I was unsuccessful with a grant application. For some reason, I felt indignant and sought an informal conversation with the funder. Maybe it was the kind of impetuousness of youth or some sense of, I did a brilliant application, how could anybody turn it down? Whatever the reason being, I found a way to talk to the funder. And I managed to get a meeting with the grant officer on the site in the project I was running. We had a warm, friendly conversation about race and making change happen. Subsequently, they gave us a grant and increased the amount we were asking for. And somewhere in the correspondence, they stated the obvious. It's not only the project that they believe in, it's also the people. We've got to believe in ourselves, and we've therefore got to keep pushing forward. I've also had experience and at times witnessed the limitations that funders can ascribe to some organizations and not others. I once employed a white consultant that told me a funder had asked him if I would run off with £10,000 that we were applying for. Thankfully, the consultant conveyed to the suspicious funder that my lifestyle meant I would not need to stoop so low. Many funders work from a mindset reinforced by racial prejudice and under-examination of societal attitudes that Black and brown communities cannot be trusted with substantial funds. This leaves funders setting low expectations on the group prior to their application. Oh, they can't manage great source of money, it's too complex, too difficult, etc. As if hedging their risk, some funders will invest in Black and brown applicants finding match funding. Well, let's make things slightly more difficult. If you can get 20% from somewhere else, then you're okay, we'll help you out. It can be reasonable at times, but not in the way in which it's being constantly used in our organizations. These low expectations have a damaging effect and informs the tone of the relationship. If groups succeed in getting funding, it is often just enough to do the task. Rarely is it enough for an evaluation or to explore what other impacts could be achieved, or even just basic research and development. What next? Those of us who are focused on doing the work rather than perpetually fundraising end up lurching from one short-term funding period to another. While investment in personal and organizational learning are essential, there are large numbers of funders that constantly suggest that training is the solution. Let's provide them another training program, another management development program, while still giving them barely enough money to deliver the results that are wanted. Some funders, like the Trust for London, would provide a more enabling package of support that reflected their commitment to building capacity within the various communities, not merely building dependency. When Black and Asian groups attempt to ask the funders that they think they have a relationship with for a step change in investment, they rarely get it. At the Arts Council, we managed to increase the number of Black, Asian, and minority groups, about 20 plus groups within the national portfolio, but mostly at the lower end of funding. The concession was that at least they got stability for 3 to 4 years, and we hope that they'll use that to build on going forward. Now, just in case I've lost you and I've not been making my points crystal clear, let me punctuate them now quickly. Many funders are reluctant to acknowledge the failure of white civic society institutions and their support of Black, Asian, and minority organizations in the infrastructure. Funders lower expectations of our potential. We can't give them too much money. They provide small grants. They restrict development. The funders want to invest a lot in training, but not in delivery and seeking outcomes. Funders create insecurity and unstable organizations. We need to transcend this. We need to give ourselves time and space to be ambitious and forge a plan. If we do not, funders will determine our futures and trap us in a cycle of impoverishment. Working with funders should be, at its best, be about a mutual partnership to achieve societal advancement. Let me ask the question, where are the organizations of size, scale, history that have been supported by funders to grow and make a viable contribution to civic society? There are very few of those, if any. And that must be an indictment, I think, on what funders have been doing over the years. Our organizations are not just in response to societal disregard, but our organizations engaged in both improve people's lives and contribute to society. These organizations have built pride, retained our sanity, created space to breathe, provide a place for shared purpose, and enable shared memories and stories. These organizations, alongside genuine partners, have made civic society tolerable. We manage the pain and discrimination of white society while endeavoring to build fulfilling lives for the future. All too often, I found that funders were comfortable providing restricted funding, as many were neither at ease with the purpose of the organization or understand its contribution. In some instances, our organizations and its leadership might be fortunate to be adopted. They have built a rapport with a particular funder, but whilst warm and friendly, it does not lead to organizational growth and transformation. The voluntary sector itself has been ambivalent about Black-led organizations. Our organizations need to re-examine how we work and think of new ways to make a lasting impact. Growing everyone's potential to live their best lives must be our aspiration, and that must mean encouraging everyone to be vocal, active advocates for enhancing life, theirs and others. We are strong together, a cliche, I know, but it's a truth. To achieve this, however, we have to invest in collaborations that are based on mutual understanding and respect for each other's contributions to be made going forward. Building meaningful relationships across communities and sectors is the only way we can forge a better future. This question of making substantial change is critically important. Some might argue that BME-led organizations exist to plug a hole. They are wrong. We are fortifying a shared humanity for the benefit of all. If they, the complex infrastructure of white middle-class society, were more inclusive, then our organizations might not need to exist. The leadership of the funding world is predominantly white middle class, and like the rest of society, it has done a great job of employing people in its own image. Black Lives Matter forced some introspection for a little while. I hope they use this moment to create substantial change and make an impact beyond short-term symbolism. But let me close with 5 key points. We need to make sure that we do not go quietly. Make everybody know about the success and impact that we are having. We cannot afford to understate the quality of our work because we are too busy doing the work. Avoid, where possible or relevant, thinking solely about project delivery and think in terms of building institutions. This requires investing thought and plans about the future you want as opposed to the focus on the short term. Maximize your support. Get everyone to be engaged cooperatively in making your venture a success. Board members, volunteers, engaged communities, make everyone an ambassador. Where possible, forge relationships with several funders, not one, not even a couple, as many as you can so that you are edging your bets and building a dialogue for change. An endeavor that builds for the long term. And lastly, create a captivating vision for the future that grows the critical mass of support. Be ambitious.
Wow, that was fantastic. And over to you, Halima.
Thank you, Carol. Yep, most certainly that was fantastic. And this is why we needed the kind of inspiration piece, David, because if we went straight into the panel, I think we would have got into a lot of the kind of nuts and bolts of the discussion. So we really, really, really needed an inspirational, challenging, provocative piece that gets us all to think about that beautiful poetry that you brought in, Marlene, and just really, I suppose, hitting home hard with those messages around why we're here, why we need to reflect with passion, emotion, but also that lived experience that is you just described, I think, going back 30 years. You know, what I found so powerful there was that story, that journey that Marlene started and you finished off, but for the sector, right? So starting with Marlene's individual perspective, story, voice, and you kind of summing this up for the sector in a more seismic way was really, really powerful. So thank you for setting the scene for us. And we're honored to have the years of experience that you bring to the table. And we're gonna open up a panel conversation based on what you've shared with us. And before we do that, I'm going to introduce the panel participants for the next session. You've already been introduced, David, but you know, I'll just reintroduce you again in case anybody's confused. David, you come with, you know, what, 30 years experience, senior management in the voluntary sector, public sector in the UK. You have worked with all of the players and sectors, and you've challenged all of the players and sectors. You bring that passion, not just from your own work, but to equality and racial justice, which shine through as you spoke. So thank you for being with us. We've already had an introduction from Marlene, but you know what, Marlene, you're humble. So it's better that somebody else introduces you as well, right? You have worked on social issues as a performing artist for many, many years, both as a founder and creative director of Moville Theatre. You've graduated from Birmingham Theatre School, as you said, in 2004. Your performances have included the Birmingham REP Theatre, the Coventry Belgrade Theatre, Language Alive, the Playhouse, The Other Way Works, Open Stage Productions, and so many other creative platforms, including the Shaw Theatre. You were part of the Black Dress Theatre Festival, and you also played Mother in Inside Out, a short film that won the Black International Film Festival. And apart from working as an actress, as you were saying, and we obviously saw the amazing spoken word that you just performed, you're also a mentor and a coach, and you work with children and young people in established projects, trying to get every young person to believe in themselves, that they can access the arts just like everybody else. So truly an inspirational. Thank you for being with us. And then we've got Kieran Boyle. Kieran, you are the CEO of Guy's and St. Thomas's charity, and you're responsible for leading the organization from the top to the bottom. And since beginning your career at the Boston Consulting Group, which is management consultancy, one of the 5 best in the world, you've worked across the public sector at Number 10 and the Department for Business and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So you come from much more of a traditional established background, but now working in our sector and hoping to bring in a lot more of that established structure, but also some innovation to our work. You sit on many boards, including the Big Society Capital, the Design Council, and Catch-22. You're a member of the Mayor of London's Childhood Obesity Task Force and the Advisory Council of the Impact Investment Institute. Kieran, you also chair the investment committee of Nesta's Cultural Impact Development Fund. And in 2014, you were selected as the Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum. You're absolutely passionate about data and all things that can be measured and driven to shape our health as well. Thank you for being with us. And then we've got David Weaver. David, you are a social worker, senior manager within local government, university lecturer, been a political advisor as well to 2 senior government ministers. You're currently the president of the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy. You're also the chair of the Coalition of Racial Equality Organisations, and you're a senior partner of DWC Consulting. But most excitingly for us, you're also a recent founder of the Balbar Foundation, which is a new type of foundation looking at the way in which foundations serve communities and addressing both the chronic underfunding, but thinking about innovation and change in the ecosystem as well. And for organizations obviously led by communities of color. What a great panel to be chairing and to ask and answer some of the difficult questions around the discussion we have ahead today. So I'm going to start with maybe a big question. And I suppose you alluded to it, David, and so did you, Marlene. So, you know, this is 2021. We could have been having this conversation around a lack of funding in the BME-led sector for many, many years, but there's something quite pivotal and critical this year, which is around a kind of symbolic organization around Black Lives Matter and all the issues that matter to us because of the tragedy of George Floyd's murder, but you know, the long-term issues around how our sector is funded and the injustices that our communities face, but also because of COVID. Now, given the fact that in 2021, quite a lot has changed, how hopeful are you that this doesn't become something that's a trend, as I think you said, Marlene? And if you're less hopeful, what do you need to see happen to make sure this is permanent and that attention on our sector remains permanent? So I'm going to start with David, and then if each of the panelists could answer that question, we'll then take on questions from the audience as well. Over to you, David.
Thank you. That's a difficult question. How hopeful am I? In all honesty, I would say right now, I am not greatly hopeful. I think that the cloud of political darkness is moving in the wrong direction. We've got a government that I think is indifferent, and certainly we've got institutions that are unduly compliant in terms of conceding to government stances. That means that the actual investment in our community becomes harder to achieve, and we have to make the money that comes into our community work much more to get the same results as we were doing beforehand. I think I'm not hopeful because I think that the impact on active citizens. The leadership in communities is even more intense. It's corrosive. It's expecting them to do far more with far less, and it erodes their aspirations, their hopes, and their dreams. And I think that's very difficult, because in communities that don't have a great deal, we are reliant on these individuals to inspire, to encourage us in our dark moments, and we've got too many of them. I think we're in a standstill position, if not slightly corrosive in terms of going backwards for a period. And we can only hope that we can get through this dark period and begin to rebuild. I do not see cause for vast hope. I think there is a great deal of tokenism that's around at the moment in reaction to Black Lives Matter, because it's embarrassing. But this is a society that is failing to have honest conversations about race, and has always failed to do so consistently. It'll have a blip of a conversation, then it'll vanish. So my commentary at the moment is not one of upbeat. It's one of merely, let's survive these treacherous periods.
Thank you, David. And I will go to the other panelist members with that question. And I suppose that maybe I'm looking for a short answer to follow-up question there is, you've obviously answered you don't feel hopeful. What would you need to see happen? I mean, those of us who work in the sector say these days, you know, if we are on trend, we're going to make sure we permanently stay on trend. So what do you need to see happen to make sure it stays as a permanent trend?
What needs to happen is, I think we need to be building institutions for the long term. We get caught so much up in short-term funding programs. And I know right now in COVID, we are full of short-term funding, if there's any funding at all. But what that does to us is it limits our horizons. We just plan to get by as opposed to plan to build. We need the larger institutions to become partners in engaging us in growing capacity, and resist the urge to believe that we are irrelevant. We are a temporary blip, because what white middle class voluntary sector's perspectives is that we are a temporary aberration until they really take over and do the real job. And that the problem of race and all the manifestations around that in terms of its intersectionality is only temporary, because the real voluntary sector is there to do the task of meeting that gap, as is the mythology of Labour being the party that serves our needs as well. It has failed to do so in the past and continues in its silence right now.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's definitely a lot of assumptions there, isn't there? And the way things used to work, or the way things will always work. And perhaps if one thing COVID has taught us, that we can't really rely on the way things have always worked, and that applies to our work as well. So let me turn to Marlene with the same question. I sense you will say you don't feel hopeful, but please obviously say it in your own words. And if not, what would you need to see happen and change? So David mentioned, you know, investment in their institutions, but over to you, Marlene. What are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I completely agree with David. I'm trying to have that hopeful head on, because you have to have some sort of hope. But it's the tokenism, as you said. It's being left to kind of fend for yourself. So once, you know, all the funding's out there to help, you know, BME or, you know, the Black Lives Matter. And I spoke to a lady, and she was saying that she doesn't want to pimp out any Black people for organizations so that they can look great, because they haven't been thinking about it. And I felt when she said that, I understood what she was saying, because it was all of a sudden people are saying, oh, you know, we've recognized that you're a company and we would like to work with you. I've been here for like 6 years and trying to establish my work. And it's just now, because it's been highlighted, because it's in your face, that we've got to make do. And in terms of sometimes the funding is around, oh, it's around this type of people, it's around this type of people. So it's just going towards what needs help at the time. But as you said, you know, investing in the institution, helping us grow, helping us to understand the industry and to become better leaders, rather than just project. And in my response, I did say that, I said, I'm too busy doing the work and trying to survive rather than actually all I want to do is create work and do other projects rather than almost kind of saying the same thing because of the theatre and the current issues of now. There's so much history that we should look at, but there's also so much things that we're doing now which are not related to race. It's just kind of everyday things, other types of issues that we want to talk about. But yeah, that definitely needs to have the stamp on it. How do smaller organisations get help into enterprising themselves and elevating themselves? So yeah, but I've always got hope. And I think if we didn't, I'd just literally just not do nothing. So.
Absolutely, Marlene. And what I'm thinking about is between what you and David talked about. So you talked about individuals needing to kind of front out a lot more and cover and compensate for a lack of investment in the ecosystem. David, you said that we need to move away to building institutions. And what this is reminding me of is the fact that those of us who work in the BME sector, we know because there's such a chronic underinvestment, that individual that does work in that sector is burnt out continuously. And it's almost exploitative, isn't it? So what we're arguing for is investment in institutions so that our bright individuals, when they are working and showing their passion, they can continue to add value and not just do what they need to do to survive at the bare minimum. And it reminds me a little bit around that conversation that we're having with the SEAL report as well, like how much of racism is individual and can be fixed at the individual level, and how much of the challenge is at the institutional level. And I think even here, when we talk about the BME investment and the BME sector, voluntary sector, if we only pick the bright individuals that we can invest in, those shining stars that we can kind of celebrate, but at the expense of a wider system that can carry more people through, then we're only left with individuals that will shine or fail or succeed. It doesn't build all of us. So I suppose that's also a point around institutional racism and a lack of institutional investment in our sector versus focusing on just individuals. And as an individual, Marlene, you and I will probably really love to be invested in. We would probably love it, right? You could do a PhD, I could do another PhD, and we will invest in ourselves. But it doesn't lift the entire community, does it? It will take longer to lift the entire community that way. So building collectively in institutions makes sure that more people get through. So that's what I'm thinking in terms of your dialogue. I'm going to hand over now to David for, I guess, the same question. Any reflections that you have on how much hope you have and what else you would do to make sure the trend is permanent and not performative?
Well, I mean, like Marlene, I have to have some hope. I mean, as a descendant of the enslaved, and when I think of what our ancestors went through and what they've bestowed onto us, then I have to have some hope. But at the same time, I hear what both David and Marlene are saying. I think for me, if we see the panacea to the problem as being getting extra funding or being recognized by funders, I don't have any hope, because history has told us time and time again that we have cyclical conversations. This is like deja vu. I was a political advisor to the voluntary sector minister many years ago, and it's the same conversation over and over again. If the panacea to the problem, the way we see it, is that we have to have extra funding to the sector, no, I don't. If it is about what is it that generations of Black people, not only here, but across the world, have to do to eradicate racism, then I do have hope. I think that the events of Black Lives Matter, and I caveat, I hear what people are saying, but I think that awakening around the world and that coming together and that international thinking and activity does give me hope. I think in relation to the sector, I think, and David, you gave a very eloquent speech, and I haven't seen you for many years, you look younger. So a brilliant speech. And I think for me, it's about doing for self. And there are many organizations now, UBelly, there's the Baobab Foundation, that are premised on that notion of doing for self. And I think that's really the way forward. I think that the pandemic and the aftermath of the pandemic, in terms of the mental health crisis that we're going to be facing as communities, the further inequalities in terms of health, on employment, the economy, and so forth. Sort of writ large, the challenges that we have. But I do think that the sewerage report, as David rightly referred to it as, has been a uniting piece. It is really showing that we have to address those issues around institutional racism and institutional discrimination. Funders weren't set up, the funding bodies weren't set up to address issues of institutional discrimination or institutional racism. Bourneville, it was the improvement of factory workers, no alcohol. If you go around that area, you can't build a pub around that area of just outside Birmingham up until now. Cadbury's and others, they were addressed, or they were set up to do good, but they were not established to address institutional poverty or institutionalized racism or institutionalized discrimination. So I don't have any hope in relation to that. I think we need to be doing for self. But as a descendant of slaves, we have to have hope.
Very powerful, David, very powerful. And I suppose for funders that maybe traditionally started out as charitable philanthropic organizations who were there to respond to a gap possibly in the system, rather than be looking at the structure not being fit for purpose, that is quite a challenge for funders, I believe. But hopefully, obviously we have to do it for ourselves. But equally, I think funders need to be challenged in that way to say, well, it was that model of philanthropy based, 200 years ago. Is that fit for purpose, and how do they need to be shifting? And I think many of our funders are, but perhaps we want that needle to shift faster than is happening at the moment.
Because those conversations are taking place now. And I think the opportunity now is that there's a reframing of that conversation. Do I have any hope in the short term? Not in terms of institutional change, but I think there are incremental changes that can be made if we do our bit as the Black voluntary sector and Black communities.
Thank you. I'm going to pass over to Kiran now with the same question. How hopeful are you that this stays more permanently as a focus, that investment in BME-led groups? How hopeful do you feel?
Thanks, Halima. I would say hopeful, not especially confident, for exactly the reasons that David, Marlene, and David have set out. I'm very firstly just want to say thank you also to be here today. It's a real privilege and learning a great deal from this conversation. I really wanted to pick up on a point that David made in his very powerful speech, which is for the reason why I'm not so confident, which is just the resistance to talk about racism in Britain. So I run a very old health foundation. Itself has a history connected to colonialism. We ran about 18 months ago, we ran an international conference on health in cities. The cities see all sorts of intersections, but also cracks, around economic segregation and housing segregation and racial segregation. And it just really struck me how almost nobody from Britain spoke about racial segregation. People from places like France and Brazil did, but there was this kind of very curious resistance in the UK to that. And I think that is very challenging for the question that you asked, Halima. So, I mean, the extent to which the last year has led to a more urgent awareness of the links between race and poor outcomes in society, it has clearly. But of course, those inequalities for us, we look at health inequalities, they're not new. Nor am I totally convinced that people have got past seeing that, really seeing that racism is the issue here. I think there can be incremental improvements. I totally agree with David's point around how we need different types of foundations involved. I think there are some incremental solutions. My concern is that funders can make this issue really quite abstract. And so that's part of why you see the same structural inequities that you see in society as a whole playing out in the funding world around process decision making and public engagement and service design and all the stuff that we'll be discussing, no doubt. But part of the answer, I think, for funders is when issues are systemic, just to look very systematically at our own processes as well. What do they replicate? What do they embed? What deliberate choices are they making? What unintentional choices are they making? And we've got to do the work. So perhaps I can share some of what we're learning from our work, but we've got a very long way to go. So in answer to your question, hopeful, we've got to be hopeful, but not especially confident.
Okay, very similar responses there, but some more than others probably trying to push the boat out a little bit more in terms of accountability, which is great to hear, because obviously we don't expect the BME sector to be one homogenous voice that all agrees, and that's actually a bit of a problem that we face even from the Runnymede side. There is expectation, the race equality, BME sector all agrees with one voice, and we don't have our differences. I have a personal challenge with that too. So knowing that we all united actually, despite our differences, because we should have those differences, over the Sewell report was actually fundamentally an inflection point for us, wasn't it? So I think that's really helpful to see the differences in your responses as well. I'm going to just come back to, I think, an important point that keeps coming up in this panel, but you've also raised elsewhere in your individual work. And I suppose at the Runnymede, we hear this a lot in a different context, lack of trust, this word called trust. You know, in the vaccine conversation that everybody's talking about lack of trust and so on. I'm going to bring that concept to this conversation, lack of trust in the BME sector, BME leaders. What's that mean? Does it mean a lack of trust because we just don't know how the sector works? Is it something more deliberate? Is it about the system lacking nuts and bolts and systems and accountability that, you know, what is it? What do we mean when we say a lack of trust? And I'm going to go over to Marlene for that one first.
In terms of my experience with lack of trust, in the piece I say, you know, the mentality of the crab in a barrel. And I myself has been, I don't want to say victim, but because I'm providing opportunity for other people. So as you said, you know, this opportunity has come. I want to kind of have a foundation where, you know, we're all eating, we're all pulling together, we're all creating. But sometimes because you are doing it for the greater good and you're creating this opportunity for other people, people will see certain things and want to just take. And my kind of experience is taking from within the sector, within mine's the arts industry. So I've had my company taken, literally lifted and put on another website. And when I've read it, I've gone, that's my work. What's happening? And that's because I trusted someone enough to work with me in order to, it wasn't just for me, but for everyone else. The work that I'm doing is for everyone else. But it's this kind of, wow, there's that pot of funding. So you're doing this. I know I've got the resources. I'll just take and go. So I think there is a trust within the community and the trust within individuals. And I said in the piece, the response was that it's about being authentic, being honest, having those conversations. Why are you not trusting people? And so from my point of view, it's in terms of just the people itself in these organizations. You know, a funder asking if they're going to run off with money when you don't need to run off with money. But then there are examples where people have gone and taken the money and you know, lived their best life in the Canary Islands or wherever. But genuine, honest people that are trying to come up, it's that honesty and that trust. And I feel that, especially up in Birmingham, there is a little bit of a, this is ours. So we work here, this is ours, we work here. And when I started, was like, I want to work with everyone. I want to just like create. So now that I'm, as I said, 15 years in, there is a part with my work that I'm very much, these are the people I work with, but I will branch out when I get stronger, when I understand more, and I've got protection. And I think that's another thing, protecting each other. Where is the protection there? So I think that's from my experience in terms of trusting.
Mm-hmm. Very, very interesting. Thank you, Marlene. And I suppose the same question back to, let's go to David. Trust came out in your inspirational speech, and I've heard that mentioned so many times. And I might throw a little bit of a curveball at you, so to give you a more challenging response, to get a more challenging response from you, David, because often when you think of self-starters and entrepreneurs that kind of take huge risks with the stock markets and so on, we don't really talk about a lack of trust there. We just think they're going to go and make $1 million. Whereas when it comes to small charities, BME-led charities, we'll say, oh, but there's no system on track and they haven't set up as a charity for a year and so on. But we don't say, oh, they're entrepreneurs and risk. What's going on there? Over to you.
I think there are a number of things. I think that we exaggerate the issue of trust in our communities. I think there's a phenomenal amount of trust in our communities. Because I think we exaggerate it for reasons I'm not too sure, but we don't ever look at the lack of trust in the white communities and the escalation of white failure and white institutions taking away the money, of large scale money. So what happens in our community, we have no comprehension about the scale of things. We are picking up peanuts and small amounts of money if that ever happens. And part of that, I think, in our communities is that we invest a great deal more hope, if I can cite my colleague, my other David here, in those of us who come from a history of suffering and oppression will think that it is just morally wrong to be taken from each other in these dire moments. And therefore we put a high level of morality on it. But we are creating, we've got a society in which we value individualism and we value everybody for themselves. So it's inevitable that someone's going to say, well, I'm going to cut corners here. I'm going to take what Marlene's done because it makes me look good. I don't have to put the hard work in. I'm going to grab what I can now because it's a grab. It's a environment that draws us into everybody for themselves. Mm-hmm. But we understate how many others are doing great work collectively, are demonstrating and modeling leadership, integrity, and good work. And I think that's what we have to elevate more of, because there's a lot of us doing that extra investment, mentoring, support without remuneration for the commitment of our communities. I think there is a tension that we have to address in making sure that we are promoting that positive image, because what we've got to work against is this onslaught of invisibility, this onslaught of only white middle class people can do it. And I make no bones about identifying that category, because if you're white working class, you're not in the conversation at all. And certainly we have to be clear about where power sits, who's casting the influence. And so I think definitely in terms of the narrative, we've got to get ourselves in a position whereby we are building our confidence. And I think this issue that you mentioned earlier on about enfranchising more people into and acknowledging more people in the field we're in is one about, if people like us are seen to be credible and have integrity, then others will join the engagement because we model what can be. We model leadership, particularly in a contaminated environment, as Kieran says, that is petrified of talking about race, colonialism, and slavery.
Thank you, David. I've got nice comments from the audience where they're saying absolutely excellent points. After 40 years of activism, they totally agree with you on what you've just said. Let's go back to that point around fear then. What is it? Where's the fear coming from to talk about these issues openly, about racism, so on? Is that fear coming from, I suppose, a place where we never really quite tackled with our history of colonialism and our place and sense of belonging? And somebody said on the chat line, the root of all of this awkwardness and uncomfortableness is because we don't reckon with our history and our colonialism and our ancestries and so on, and how we all got here. So is there a place, I suppose, in our anti-racism work, even in this conversation about funding, in order to build more trust? Do we need to do more around building a shared understanding of our empire, colonialism, and where we are, how we are, where we got to, and so on? Is there something to be said about that, David Weaver?
Yeah, definitely. I think, and one of the things that Baobab, and by the way, I'm a co-founder and co-chair of Baobab, very much inspired by Jake Ferguson. So I wanted to clarify that.
Thank you.
Who spoke with the Coalition of Race Equality Organizations, and we got that going. So just to say that. But I think that's right. There's that fear thing because this society has not come to terms with its past. It just hasn't. And so what Kieran said about that inability to look in the eyeball and have a conversation about racism, where it came from, that some of the manifestations of that in terms of intergenerational trauma and how we are and so forth is as a result of that. And part of that fear and part of that trust that we were speaking about is the whole piece around society sets itself up to divide and rule. So we will have those elements where we mistrust each other. And even in terms of the funding regime, where you have small pots of money and you say that's for the ethnic minorities and we run and fight around it, that will instill that lack of trust, and it is there. But I think the point that Marley and David made is a big one as well, that people downplay the levels of trust and relationships that we do have in our sector, and especially right now. Over the last year, when Baobab was setting up, we said one of our values is unity. We are not going to allow ourselves to be divided. And so we spend a lot of our time giving out information about what other organizations are doing. So I think there's something around us not believing the hype, not believing the narrative. Actually, there is a lot of trust because we have that common experience, but not taking away from the fact that actually there is that mistrust. But actually, it comes back to that fear of the system, which is why I keep saying to anybody who listen, let's not let's not rely on that. Let's not just rely on that funder regime. What is it that we can do for ourselves? How do we reshape those partnerships? What the kind of conversations do we need to have with funders to ensure that there is parity? There's parity. How do we help them to shape their values and their purpose? All of them. Even if you're not talking about racism, you were talking about poverty. Poverty is not just some isolated entity that you tackle in Birmingham. You've got to tackle the systemic and institutionalized element of that. So I think there's something about how we work with those funders, those authorities, and we keep that fight on. And that's why this Sewell report is so important, that we united around that, around institutional racism and institutional discrimination. So when we do that, we then address the issue of fear, because they are, I think there are some white people that over the last year have started to look at this whole thing again. And then when you have the Sewell report say, well, you don't have anything to think about because your default thinking was correct, that's where we challenge that. So I feel hopeful. There is that unity. There is that trust. It needs to be built, but it's caused by the institutionalized racism, which is historic and it has intergenerational manifestations.
Yeah, no, it's very powerful what you're suggesting, which is that don't fall victim to a narrative that you haven't set yourself, and actually build up the narrative that you want, that one around unity, that one around collaboration, and others will follow. And you point to, I suppose, the risks that the Sewell Commission kind of unraveled for us, which is that people started talking about that really difficult one. And we were like, well, once you start talking about it, we might get somewhere. But if you then start closing the door a little bit or questioning whether that should have been open to begin with, it makes us nervous a bit, doesn't it, to put it politely. But I'm just going to go over to Kieran as well. Same question, that fear, do we need to reconcile our own history of colonialism and how we got to be here as a kind of first step towards greater confidence in our own assets, resources, and our own voice, really? You mentioned it, and I just want to bring you back to that point again.
Yeah, no, thank you. And yes, yeah, like simple answer, yes, we do. Yes, we do. In fact, we've been working with David Bryan on looking at these questions for ourselves as an organisation. I mean, on the question of trust is earned, and I think David's challenge to us of our foundation stepping beyond the symbolic. The jury's totally out on that. So have we earned trust? We need to see. We need to see there. I think for foundations, getting back to this theme though of kind of how are we doing things is so critical, because I think that's how we build trust. And so many of the processes that foundations, as the most institutional of institutions that exist in society, they're designed not to build trust. They're not conversational, they're not focused on relationships, they're often really about filling in an application form, the one thing that won't create a partnership. And so I am confident, or I am hopeful, that more foundations are grappling with that and getting to a better place. One of the things that I know that we as an organisation have really benefited from is work also just to look at, we do a lot of research as an organisation, and we've been really helped by investing in different types of organisations who will do that research, help us understand better the issues that we're grappling with. And I think that's a route to trust. So, for example, we've invested in, with a partnership with the Social Innovation Partnership, community researchers based in the communities where we're working, who can explain to us better as an organisation what's actually happening, and they're much more involved in the research, the projects, the activities that come out of them. I think one of the main things that we spotted through that is hugely helpful is actually how much of the environment that exists around funders that helps us do our work is white-led, and how few organisations there are that's led by people from minority ethnic backgrounds, although that's, for a lot of us funders, that's exactly where we're trying to focus much of our work. So kind of early steps there, but we're trying to invest more in that group of organisations too. So trust is earned, and I think those are some of the steps that we're going to have to go through to start earning some of that trust.
Thank you. And that self-reflection from a larger funder charity is quite important, really, to kind of meet that conversation halfway as well. So that's really great to hear. Earning trust can be lost quite easily, right? But to earn it takes a lot longer. Thank you. Well, I'm gonna look at a few questions from the audience, because we've got some fantastic questions coming through. So I'm going to try one. Whoever wants to answer it, actually. How can we continue to look at the current systems of failure to provide solutions to the crisis? And I suppose that's taking an iterative look at how we learn from failure in a positive way, not because we want to blame or point fingers, but how can we learn positively from failures? Anybody who wants to go with that one?
Let me jump in, another crack at that. I think, having said at the beginning, I wasn't hopeful. Let me contradict myself in some respect and say where I do have hope is at a local level and community level. I think that one of the things we have to learn from setbacks as opposed to failures is what can we do? How can we do things differently going forward? And I think part of that is, as David Weaver said earlier on, is by forging better collaborations, more alliances, and I think and trying, regardless of the endorsement of funders, to build an agenda that you build on going forward, because there's a tendency, I think, in some of our organizations to become so driven and so preoccupied with the funding agenda that we therefore fail to really address the key issues. The issues of education, for instance, or miseducation, has been persistent. I mean, I began my presentation by talking about how back in 1968 we were invisible in the curriculum and still are. But that's not only those of us of slavery background. Everybody who's not of a particular class background or culture is invisible. So the whole of the range of ethnic differences in this country don't feature in our history in this country at all. We are invisible and temporary. So if anything, we're always recently arrived, and at some point we'll recently go. And so I do think that part of the challenge is building locally, building together, and in many respects, forging alliances that make us bigger in terms of impact and bigger in terms of our intellectual challenge. We get setbacks around the sewage report. I mean, it's an insult to humanity, that kind of declaration of false intent, because it has no substance, but yet they're trying to change the narrative that's already corrupted. We've got to therefore get into a position whereby we are constructing a positive narrative. One of the problems we are constantly besieged with is being put into a defensive position. react to institutional onslaughts and not have the space to say, what are we for? What are we trying to construct? That is to a broader agenda. So there's a long rambling answer, but my concern here is that hope can only come out of us forging a proactive aspiration, not constantly being in deficit mode.
Yeah, I mean, I'd add to that. I think it's about what do we want more than what we don't want. I think there's something about that forward-looking piece. And I think learning from lessons of the past, and this is one of the things that not just Baobab, there are other organizations doing this. For us, what's really important is about decisions about funding and priorities about funding being set by those closest to communities. That's really, really important, because in the past, we've been led by the criteria that's been laid down by funders. And then given that their funding bodies and those in management of it are not diverse, do not have that lived experience, it hasn't happened. We can point to lots of failures because we've been chasing the priorities that have been set there. And I think what we need to be doing, and this is really important to Baobab, is really regionalizing, localizing, make it individual community person, individual specific within communities, what those priorities should be, and get them involved. They're the biggest ambassadors for change. They're going through that lived experience and looking at how we create leadership and empower leadership at those local. Now that seems like mantra. That sounds like something you read in the book. Well, you do, but I think there are examples of Black organizations doing it. And the other thing I think we should learn from is that we don't just keep thinking about this notion of the Black voluntary sector, because we can become so self-absorbed, so self-analytical that we forget what we're about. And then we become actually the buffer between the communities and government and those other major institutions that are keeping us down. So there's something about us looking at ourselves and recognizing how we work has to be informed all the time by a focus on what our noble cause is. Why are we doing this? We're doing this because of what's happening in our communities. And my last point is this, is that I think that a real big issue right now is going to be mental health. You know, all the research, all the empirical evidence shows that when you've gone through crisis, like the type that we've gone through, where COVID-19 has had that massive disproportionate impact on our communities, my proximity to death, to disaster, to anxiety, to depression, and so forth, as a result of this, is far closer than my white colleagues. That is going to have a massive impact in terms of the mental health. And 2-3 years down the road, it's going to hit large right at the time where the economy has been is impacting disproportionately again on our communities. So I think there is something about being really focused on communities. That's a lesson I think that we need to learn from the past.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Focus on communities and set the agenda on what we do want, not what we don't want. I was speaking to a couple of campaigning organizations a few days ago, and they were saying, we're constantly in our sector, we're just in the reactive mode, aren't we? We just, you know, whether it's Grenfell, whether it's, riot, we're always in defensive, reactive mode. What we really want to get to is how we positively set that agenda for change, which will take us a lot further. And I think you said the same thing. What do we want, not what do we don't want? So I'm going to hold on to that, because that's really, really positive thinking, David. And I suppose we've got probably about 6 minutes left, and I'm thinking a little bit about using our time now just to kind of get some treasures from you, nuggets from you around, maybe like a kind of go around the panel just to ask, you know, we're starting a conference looking at those issues, really digging deep into people's experiences and so on. Can I ask you individually to just give us a few thoughts on what you think we should be thinking about, talking about, and how we should be moving some of those discussions? And let's go to Kieran this time. What do you want the conference to be thinking and reflecting on?
Well, good question. A few things spring to mind. Firstly, how we get past the challenge that you have a conference like this, and it could very quickly, with being a funder here, you can very quickly get into the place of putting the challenge onto those organizations we're working with to say, you fix this for us, rather than necessarily the actual question that we should be addressing is, why does this challenge exist in exist in the first place. So spending time with that. The second thing that I've heard from Marlene and David Weaver and David, I think is, I just couldn't agree with more, which is about how you can challenge funder practices. Funders have much further to go. I think there is a commitment to improve practices, and often the issues are that funders aren't well informed enough about what they could be doing better, and we need to hear that. So what are the ways in which we can challenge funder practices so that those who do want to do better can have signals about what they need to be doing better as well? And I know that that has been a lifetime's work for many people on this call as well.
Brilliant. And hold that thought, because that's what we will take forward to the next session as well. And so same question to Marley.
Yeah, I think get funders being accessible, so that we can have a conversation, and being open to be challenged as well, because a lot of the times what you're saying is that we are when they put out a funding commission, we have to bend ourselves to fit that funding commission, what David Weaver was saying, and we lose sight of ourselves. So how can we say no to that bending? Say, actually, this is what we need as a community, as organizations, and not feel afraid that we're going to be blacklisted or we can't say something, but really having the confidence, being challenging the funders, and having these forums like this where it should be different funders and we're talking to them on a level, not that they're here and this is what we think and go forth and do what you need to do. So for me, I want that fear in terms of accessing funding to just kind of dissipate, but also, as you were saying as well, David Weaver and David Bryan, not just going to funders. How can we enterprise us? How can we elevate ourselves? So that's what I want to know and want to learn. And yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. So no to the bending. If we were talking about code switching, we'd say don't code switch for a funder. Stay true to your purpose and mission. Absolutely. Same points back to David Bryant.
I think there are a couple of things that strike me. One is that we have to get stronger by getting bigger. I think there's a real need, and big doesn't mean one organization. It might be a series of federation alliances, a number of ways in which that can be had, so that we build towards having a critical mass as opposed to a constant microcosm of micro organizations that have little space or energy and capacity to be heard and have significance. If 25 organizations come together, as I'm sure they are doing in many places, and have their voices heard, the politicians listen, the schools listen, the universities listen. And I think there's a real importance in that, because one of the things we haven't learned from the past, because we have never been stable enough to hold on to those learnings, is how to make that happen. I think that in terms of money, search for money anywhere is my view. I got involved in this conversation because I discovered there was money in universities, and I thought, let's have some of that. And by the way, let's get them to record our contribution. That still remains the case, and I think there's some opportunities emerging, but we need independent funders to be truly independent, and therefore take the courage to make investments in communities that grow. This issue of history, every region should have its own localized history. It talks about class, a diversity of races, in its shared understanding, as opposed to what happens now is that we all fight from our position of indignant omission for our voices to be heard, and we are not creating that unified agenda that becomes the picture for the future. And I say enterprising because I just don't trust any particular source to be reliant on. And so I'm thinking the more we can have that diversity of resources, the better. And I think my last point, and it's a difficult one, is to be ambitious beyond the point of reality, because we are constraining our intellectual potential by best becoming preoccupied with what we can do now. And in the now, that I think limits us tremendously. One last micro plug, if I can allow to do so. I'm building with colleagues, not single-handedly, an art center in Brixton. It's been in the making for several years, but we are going to open the doors in November. That's taken umpteen millions to produce, and it will be an assertion and an affirmation in the community. We have to have those aspirations that is possible, even in these difficult times. Otherwise, we will consign ourselves to mediocrity.
I hear you, David. And one of my favorite words this year, should have been every year, is the word unbound. So when you talked about ambition, when we also talk about our collective history of colonialism, I love the word unbound, right? Do not be bound. For the sector, for us as individuals, as people of color and so on. So I love the ambition. And we look forward to hearing and seeing the launch of that fantastic flagship art centre in Brixton, such a symbolic place for many of our communities, not because it just happens to be in London. Let's remember Brixton's history as well. And I suppose, David Weaver, over to you for that last bit of reflection before we kind of hand over to Carol.
Okay, it's hard going at the end of this this panel, because much of it you've said already. I mean, just a few things. I think for the rest of the conference, I think let's keep it real. These are serious times. This is not, if we're having this conversation 10 years ago, we'd have a little bit of a different flavor. We're talking about death, real death, disproportionate death because of racism. So I think there's something about just keeping that in mind. These are serious times, and that society will never be effective unless it addresses this issue. So for all those white people or people that are just agnostic about the whole piece, they've got to realize unless we address this issue of inequalities and racism in our society, their lives will not be happy and their children's lives will not be happy. So that maxim of no justice, no peace it's more than a slogan. It's absolutely imperative that society addresses this. And then the second point would be about the systemic and structural discrimination and racism. What Sewell's report has gifted us is that focal point and that focus and that unity with so many people, so many different types of people around this particular issue. So I think that the conversations with funders have to be underpinned by, actually, if you're going to have some parity in terms of how we design the kind of interventions that meet what you say you want to meet, let's do that within a framework of recognizing this is about systemic change, it's about institutional change. So I think that's important as well. I think thirdly, the point I was making earlier around not being so self-absorbed as a sector that we forget what it's all about. I'm not saying that people are, but I know myself that sometimes I get so carried away with the conversation around the ecosystem and all that kind of stuff that we actually forget that this is what we're all about and this is what's going on and it's serious. The other point is about building out our narrative. We've got some brilliant journalists and writers out there that Nadine White and a member of CORE, Lee Pinkerton. Go look Twitter for his piece on Sewell's report, which was not just a rant. It was a very intelligent discourse around, so what do we need to be thinking about? So there's a narrative which says, no, we're not divided, actually we're united. And not just over in this country as well. This is a global issue. And we can link in with people that are operating in that global world who will link in with us and are linking in with us. And then the last point is around just recognizing our power as a community. We're powerful beyond measure. And we have to keep hope alive, in the words of Jesse Jackson, keep hope alive. And for me, it's like two fingers up to my ancestors who struggled so much, even my father's generation. I look at them now, that Windrush generation. Do you know what? And I literally cry. The levels of disrespect to this government has meted out to that generation is indescribable. And I take it as a personal affront. And I think there is something around recognizing that, notwithstanding that, we've done so much. I think that our contribution has to be that we bestow upon the next generation a better society than we found it. And we are in a relatively more powerful position to do so. And we've got to seize this moment. My last point really is, I'd like to commend you, Dr. Halima Begum, because I think you've really, you know, in a relatively short space of time, really sort of put on the agenda in a very intelligent and forthright way these issues. And I think this conference is testimony to that. I'd like to say thank you for inviting myself and on behalf of Baobab to this event. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, David. We're obviously playing quite a convening role here, but I'm just overwhelmed with that compliment. Thank you very much. And more importantly, you've kind of, I think what you've all done is pretty much raise the stakes for us all, really, because when we started this conference, you know, we actually had quite humble objectives to continue the conversations that we were having before COVID and Black Lives Matter. But what you've now shown us is that, God, the stakes are really different. And because of the Sewell report, more than anything, that unity, that space for hope, the way in which we collaborate becomes greater for us. And I really feel that coming across from all of you here. And what I think might be really interesting for this conference to reflect on as well is, as funders, obviously funders are not in denial of institutional racism, the public isn't. Some other parts of society might have been, but most of us are not. But it does give us an opportunity to think about how the funding regime can respond to dismantling institutional racism and what that means is around looking at the disproportionate outcomes that affect our communities. So I hope that, you know, with your contribution and blessing, you've raised the stakes for this conference. And with that, I say thank you for joining us. Hopefully you stay with us as well, because we need that challenge from you. And what a great way to start. Thank you for sharing your expertise and wisdom. And we go away blessed. Into the next session. Carol, over to you.
Thank you so much, Halima. I'd like to also echo the thanks that David passed on to you. We're coming up to one of the breaks in the program, and it's deliberately designed this way, because our intention is to give people regular breaks away from their computer screens. But when you're returning to a session, please be prompt, as the timings are quite, you know, tight. At 12:30, we've got a couple of lunchtime shorts in your program, including a short Q&A with Maurice McLeod from Race on the Agenda. And the funders for Racial Equality Alliance just completed their own research, and they're presenting their data. At 1 p.m., you'll also find today's speed networking session in your program. And just as we go, I want to say thank you so much to the whole panel. I mean, it was a privilege for me to just listen, to tweet, and to reflect. Kieran, I want to say thank you as a funder for really thinking about how we can get past the challenge, you know, not putting it on the organizations that you fund, actually committing, if I heard you correctly, to spending more time thinking about it and challenging your practices and hopefully other funders as well, because you're not necessarily always well informed. Marlene, thank you. I mean, from your powerful session earlier on, but also your charge, you know, and your honesty in talking about how funders are not always accessible or open to be challenged, the fear of being blacklisted or losing out. And I really, really like that, you know, you want to continue to have the courage and the confidence, because that's exactly what it takes to stay mission and purpose driven, and being able to communicate that with funders. David Bryan, you have inspired me so much today. Thank you. I've taken away personally your charge for us to actually be ambitious beyond the realm of reality, to have aspirations that people may not think are possible, and to be actually continually resisting being consigned to mediocrity. I really like that for my organization. And you know what? I'm going to take the charge also to search for money any and everywhere. I believe, like you, in having diverse income streams that are not dependent on anyone. And David Weaver, the last word went to you, to be honest. We do have power. I agree with you. You said we should recognize the power we have as a community, create our own narratives, but to keep it real as well. These are serious times. Society will never be whole. It's true, because when one part hurts, every part hurts. And I really like that. Thank you. But I also like the real charge, to not be so self-absorbed that we forget what is real. So we're going to go away to lunch and come back later on thinking about what it means to keep the main things as the main things. Thank you, everybody.